Boston in 1871 was a city poised between old shadows and new ambitions. Gas lamps lined the crooked streets, their weak glow struggling against the fog that drifted in from the harbor. Carriages rattled along cobblestones slick with the grime of winter, and in the wealthier districts, the proud red brick houses stood like guardians of a society eager to hide its cracks. But among those houses, one in particular would come to command whispers for decades to come: the Callahan residence on Ashmont Hill. The house itself was neither grand nor modest, built in the federal style, with tall narrow windows and a pale stone portico. It seemed ordinary enough to those who passed. Yet neighbors claimed there was something about its silence, the way its curtains never stirred, the way its gas lights glowed late into the night, though no visitors ever came or left. The Callahan family had taken possession of it quietly, almost furtively, in the dead of winter. By morning, the house that had sat empty for 3 years after its last occupant died suddenly of fever was furnished, lit, and alive. It was the sisters who first drew attention. 2 young women, always dressed impeccably though fashion seemed to shift little upon them, appeared on the streets together like pale twins. Their names were Eleanor and Margaret Callahan, and they were said to be no older than 20. They walked arm in arm, moving with a peculiar grace, their faces calm, their lips nearly always fixed in faint, unreadable smiles. No one ever saw them apart. And no one, not once in all the years that followed, would see them age. At first, it was only curiosity. The butcher's wife remarked on how fresh their faces were, even after weeks of Boston's harsh winds. The baker, who served them daily loaves of rye bread, said they carried no coin but always produced notes perfectly crisp and new, as if freshly printed. Children whispered about them, for they never seemed to blink long, and their gray eyes, large and reflective, gave the impression of watching everything and nothing at once. One evening in March, a carriage overturned near the corner of Ashmont Hill. A young boy was trapped beneath it, his leg crushed. The sisters appeared suddenly, as though they had stepped out from the mist itself. Eleanor knelt beside the child, whispering words that none nearby could hear, while Margaret placed her hand upon his leg. Witnesses swore the bone seemed to right itself in seconds, and the boy rose uninjured. But when others rushed forward to thank them, the sisters had already turned the corner, vanishing before gratitude could be given. Such accounts quickly turned into rumor, and rumor hardened into unease. In 1871, Boston was still a city wary of witchcraft, its Puritan roots lingering like old bloodstains beneath new paint. The Callahan sisters became subjects of speculation. Were they healers, angels, or something far darker? The neighborhood divided itself into those who admired their beauty and grace, and those who crossed themselves when the sisters passed. The first true note of dread came not from the neighbors, but from the parish priest, Father Donnelly. He recalled seeing the sisters kneeling quietly at St. Ignatius one Sunday morning. Their posture was perfect, their devotion seemingly profound, but when the priest passed by with the chalice, he noticed that their lips did not move in prayer. Their eyes, gray, gleaming, and fixed straight ahead, never wavered, and he thought, though later he could never swear it, that neither breathed. Over the years, newcomers to Boston would sometimes mistake Eleanor and Margaret for 2 fashionable young ladies merely delayed in marriage, but the old families of Ashmont Hill remembered. A generation passed, and yet the Callahan sisters walked the streets exactly as before, their faces unlined, their hair unchanged, their smiles just as faint, just as enigmatic. The truth became harder to ignore after the Great Fire of 1872, when chaos swept Boston. Amid flames and smoke, dozens swore they saw the sisters walking unharmed through the inferno, their dresses untouched by embers, their skin glowing pale against the red sky. Some said they guided trapped families to safety, their hands strangely cool to the touch. Others whispered they were feeding the flames, not fighting them, their presence part of the disaster itself. By the time the city was rebuilt, the Callahan sisters were no longer just neighbors. They were a legend whispered at the hearth, a story told to wide-eyed children who dared peek up Ashmont Hill after dusk. For how could 2 young women remain young while all around them, time dragged others to wrinkles, sickness, and graves. How could they appear in church, at the market, in the square, always the same, unchanged as the decades crept on? And so, the house on Ashmont Hill, with its silent windows and glowing gas lamps, came to stand for something more than wealth or mystery. It became a boundary, a reminder that some lives follow rules, while others slip through them like mist through fingers. And at the heart of it all were Eleanor and Margaret Callahan, who never aged a day. The winter of 1871 was one of the bitterest Boston had endured in years. The Charles River froze so thick that children ran their sleds across it, and even the gas lamps sputtered weakly against the icy winds. Snow lay in heavy banks along the edges of Ashmont Hill, and carriages struggled to make the climb to its upper streets. It was in this season, when the city seemed trapped beneath iron skies, that the Callahan sisters arrived. Few saw their entrance, and yet everyone seemed to know they had come. The house on Ashmont Hill, vacant and decaying since the death of its last master, had stood dark for years. Its shutters had warped in the weather, and its iron gate leaned rusted against one hinge. On a Tuesday night in late January, with snow falling in thick, silent sheets, a carriage was seen at its door. It was black, high-backed, with lanterns that glowed faintly green rather than gold. The driver wore no livery. Some claimed he had no face at all, just a blur beneath the rim of his hat. Others swore he was a foreigner, his speech harsh and guttural as he barked at the horses. What all agreed upon was that two women descended from the carriage, their boots crunching against the snow, their figures slender beneath traveling cloaks of deep velvet. They did not look up at the gathering neighbors who peeked through their curtains. Instead, they walked with calm, unhurried steps into the waiting house. By dawn, the broken shutters were mended, the gate upright, the windows glowing with firelight, as though the house had always been lived in. It was as if the sisters had conjured their home into sudden life. Servants were never seen coming or going. Yet the house bore all signs of constant order. The walks were swept, deliveries were taken, and lamps burned each evening. Once or twice, a milkman swore he saw a tall figure in black livery, except the bottles. But when asked to describe the face, he shook his head and muttered that the details slipped from him the moment he tried to recall. The sisters themselves emerged slowly into society. Eleanor was the taller, with a face more severe, her dark hair parted cleanly at the center and drawn into a perfect coil. Margaret, by contrast, seemed softer, her hair a lighter chestnut, her smile more frequent, if no less enigmatic. They moved together, their steps in rhythm, their words few. Those who encountered them in shops or along the common recalled a strange air about them, as though they belonged to some other century, or perhaps to none at all. What unsettled people most, however, was their calm. No matter the weather, their faces remained composed. While others bent against the wind or flushed in the summer heat, the sisters seemed untouched, their complexions pale and even. Their voices, when heard, were low and steady, accented in a way no one could place. Some said Irish, others claimed French. Still others thought it a blend of both, or neither. Boston society was curious, of course. New families, especially those of refinement, were expected to attend certain gatherings. The Callahan sisters appeared at a winter musicale hosted by the Atwoods, an old family with roots stretching back to the Revolution. They entered the hall in matching gowns of pale silk, their gloves white, their jewels modest but gleaming as, if freshly cut. All eyes turned toward them, for they seemed to carry a hush into the room. When introduced, they bowed their heads gracefully, but little more. The men, eager for new faces, attempted conversation. They asked of their origins, their travels, their plans for residence in Boston. The sisters replied only with fragments. "We are newly arrived." "Boston is fine." "Yes, the snow is heavy this year." Then they would lapse into silence, their eyes glancing at one another as though sharing some unspoken communion. A pianist began to play, and it was then that Margaret rose, moving with a step so fluid it startled those near her. She sat at the instrument, her fingers gliding over the keys with a precision both masterful and haunting. The melody was unfamiliar, neither wholly cheerful nor mournful, but carrying an undertone that left listeners uneasy, as if it summoned memories long buried. Eleanor stood beside her, singing softly in a language that none recognized. Some thought it Latin, others guessed Gaelic, but even scholars in the room admitted they could not place the words. When the song ended, the sisters bowed slightly and returned to their seats. The applause was polite, even enthusiastic, yet a chill lingered. One guest later remarked that he felt as though the room had grown colder during the performance, though no draft could be found. Another insisted that his watch had stopped entirely for the length of the song, only to resume once silence fell. From that night, the Callahan sisters were both welcomed and held at arm's length. The ladies of Boston invited them to teas and charity circles intrigued by their elegance, while the men speculated endlessly about their marital status. But the sisters never courted, never so much as danced with a partner. They attended, they observed, they performed when asked, but never revealed themselves beyond the surface. It was the winter grocer, a practical man named Tobias Firth, who first noticed the oddity. He delivered apples and salted fish to Ashmont Hill each week, and it was always the sisters who answered the door. Always dressed, always composed, never ill, never disheveled, never altered in the least. He told his wife one evening that he believed them to be mannequins come to life, so flawless was their appearance. His wife laughed until she realized that after 3 months of calling, she too could not recall seeing the slightest change in them, not even the faint redness in cheeks one might expect from a Boston wind. By the time spring thawed the streets, the Callahan sisters had already become a fixture of curiosity, and though polite society still smiled and bowed, behind closed doors, whispers spread. Where had they come from? Why did their house need no servants? How could 2 women move through such a bitter winter without once showing fatigue or frailty? The truth would not emerge easily, for the Callahan sisters were patient, and in their patience lay something more unnerving than any flamboyant display. They watched, they waited, and they walked among the people of Boston as though time itself bent around them. And thus began the first murmurs of the legend, that Eleanor and Margaret Callahan were not merely women of fortune or fashion, but beings outside the common bounds of life, beings who, as many would come to claim, never aged a day. By summer of 1871, Boston's markets swelled with life. The harbor bustled with ships hauling molasses, coal, and cotton. Stalls overflowed with salted fish, apples, and bundles of herbs. Hawkers cried their wares with voices roughened by sea air, and the clang of horseshoes on cobblestones filled the mornings like a rhythm the city could not live without. It was here, amid the clamor and barter, that the Callahan sisters first began to disturb the common folk. They came every Thursday, just as the bells of St. Ignatius finished tolling noon. Eleanor always carried the wicker basket, her gloved hands neat upon the handle, while Margaret selected the goods. They moved among the stalls with an air of quiet ceremony, their gowns immaculate, their hair untouched by wind or sweat, though the rest of the crowd bustled and pushed. The vendors watched them with unease, though the sisters were always polite, their voices soft and their payment exact. It was the freshness of the money that unsettled people first. Each time they paid, the bills were crisp, uncreased, as though newly printed and slipped from the press only that morning. When one fishmonger dared to comment, Margaret only smiled faintly and said, "Time is kind to what it favors." The fishmonger later claimed her eyes gleamed silver in the sun, though he admitted to drinking heavily that day. Then came the incident with the poultry seller. A young woman had brought her sick child to the market, the boy coughing violently as she tried to gather her purchases. The sisters paused beside her. Eleanor knelt, resting her gloved hand lightly on the child's shoulder. Witnesses swore the coughing ceased at once, the boy straightening with clear eyes and a calm breath. The mother burst into tears, thanking the sisters, but they only bowed their heads and walked on, as though healing a child were no more unusual than selecting eggs. Word of such acts spread swiftly. Some called them angels in disguise, blessed with powers to cure the weak. Others hissed that they were witches, trading souls for unnatural gifts. In a city still haunted by memories of Puritan severity, neither interpretation was welcome. Markets became places of whispered debate, each Thursday drawing crowds eager to glimpse the sisters and weigh their own beliefs. Children followed them, emboldened by curiosity. They would mimic the sisters' measured steps, giggling until Eleanor turned her gaze upon them. Then the laughter would die instantly, for her stare carried a stillness that silenced even the boldest child. One boy swore that when she looked at him, he could no longer hear the shouts of the market or the clatter of hooves, only a deep ringing in his ears, as though he had stepped into another world. But it was not only children who felt altered. Grown men, rugged laborers who mocked superstition, admitted in hushed tones that the sisters unsettled them. They smelled no sweat, no perfume, no trace of human life upon them, only the faintest chill, like air from a cellar long sealed. Women remarked on how their gowns, though delicate, never frayed nor stained despite the filth of the market streets. Even mud seemed to recoil from the hems of their dresses. Soon speculation turned into fear. One week, a butcher's apprentice swore that he saw the sisters arrive at the market before dawn, hours before stalls opened. They stood in the square alone, speaking in a language he did not recognize, their voices carrying an echo though no walls surrounded them. When he tried to draw closer, he claimed his vision blurred, and by the time he regained his senses, the sisters were gone. They returned at noon as usual, their faces serene, as though nothing had transpired. Gossip spread beyond the market stalls into taverns and parlors. Were they women at all, or phantoms dressed in flesh? The city had seen its share of oddities. Con men, selling elixirs, mesmerists traveling from town to town. But the Callahan sisters were not charlatans seeking coin. They wanted nothing, needed nothing, offered no explanations. Their very indifference fed the legend. It was the grocer's wife, Mrs. Holloway, who gave the rumors their sharpest edge. She swore she had followed them one afternoon at a distance, curious to see whether they returned directly home from the market. The sisters walked arm in arm through the winding streets, unhurried, until they reached a narrow alley where the light barely reached. Mrs. Holloway expected them to emerge on the far side. Instead, the alley remained empty. She hurried forward, heart pounding, but when she peered down its length, there was no one there. The Callahan sisters had vanished, leaving only the faint echo of their footsteps. By autumn, even the clergy took notice. Father Donnelly, already uneasy from his encounter at St. Ignatius, began preaching against unnatural presences in our midst. He did not name the sisters outright, but his congregation understood. His warnings found fertile ground in a city where immigrants carried tales of banshees, fairies, and spirits from across the Atlantic. Fear, once seeded, flourished quickly, yet not all feared them. Some sought them out, quietly, in desperation. Mothers with sick children, men with injuries that would not heal, widows plagued by grief, they lingered near the Callahan house, hoping for a glimpse, a touch, a miracle. Occasionally the sisters granted it. A hand laid upon a fevered brow, a murmur whispered against a broken limb, and always the ailment lifted. Those who were cured swore eternal gratitude, though they could never explain what had truly happened. The paradox deepened. To some, the sisters were saints. To others, harbingers of corruption. To all, they were an enigma that Boston could not comfortably house. For while merchants haggled and priests thundered, the Callahan sisters walked through it all with their faint smiles and unchanging faces, as if time itself bent to let them pass. And in the crowded markets of Boston, where gossip grew like ivy, the whispers only swelled. They never aged a day. Boston's cultural pride in the early 1870s was its new conservatory of music, a place where the wealthy sent their children to learn refinement, and where the city sought to prove itself equal to Europe in cultivation. Its tall windows spilled golden lamplight over Tremont Street, and inside, echoes of piano scales and violins hummed from dawn until evening. It was here, amid the pride of Boston's rising society, that the Callahan sisters made their most unsettling impression. Their arrival was quiet as always. One April afternoon, Eleanor and Margaret appeared at the conservatory's doors, inquiring about lessons. The doorman recalled their voices, soft, lilting, and almost song-like, and admitted them at once. Within days, they were fixtures in the halls. Eleanor pursued the violin, Margaret the piano. Yet unlike other students, they carried no sheet. Music brought no instructors home and never faltered in practice. From the first, their playing astonished. Students whispered that their skill was too perfect, as if learned not through labor but through memory already possessed. Margaret's hands flew across the keys, producing melodies no teacher had assigned. Eleanor's bow drew tones so pure they seemed to vibrate in the chest, stirring emotions the listener could not name. Professors praised them cautiously, unsettled, by music that felt less like performance and more like revelation, as though the sisters were not playing notes but unlocking something already hidden in the air. One evening recital sealed their reputation. The conservatory hosted a gathering. For patrons, the hall glittering with chandeliers and lined with Boston's elite. The Callahan sisters were invited to perform a duet. They stepped onto the stage in pale gowns, moving with that same peculiar grace that made every gesture seem rehearsed by centuries. Margaret sat at the piano, her fingers waiting. Eleanor lifted the violin, chin resting upon it with a stillness that silenced the room. When they began, the hall was seized by a music unlike any composed or written. The melody swelled and bent, neither wholly joyous nor tragic, but vast, as if capturing the rise and fall of whole lifetimes in a single movement. People wept openly, without knowing why. Some clasped hands, trembling, as though memories of long dead mothers or lost childhoods flooded back in an instant. Others swore their watches stopped again, or that the very air thickened, time dragging at their limbs. When the last note fell into silence, the sisters bowed slightly and withdrew, leaving the audience stunned, unable to applaud for several long breaths. Later, when the professors attempted to transcribe what had been played, they could not. The notes resisted arrangement, dissolving on the page. "It is as if the melody exists only when they summon it," one instructor whispered, "and then it vanishes, leaving nothing but the echo." But not all were enthralled. Dr. Nathaniel Harland, a physician of reputation and a man skeptical of superstition, attended that recital and was disturbed, though not for the reasons of others. He had studied human physiology, observed fevers and fits, and to him the sisters' effect on the audience seemed unnatural, manipulative. He watched Eleanor's steady gaze upon the crowd as she played, and Margaret's faint smile, and he felt certain the music was more than sound. It was a force, bending will and memory alike. The sisters, for their part, seemed untouched by their own performance. After the recital, they lingered briefly in the hall, greeting admirers with their usual polite brevity. Their cheeks did not flush, their hands did not tremble, their composure did not waver in the slightest. Where other young women glowed with excitement or modesty after praise, the Callahans merely inclined their heads, as though the applause were neither unexpected nor meaningful. It was at the conservatory that the first true rumors of immortality began to form. Students gossiped freely, comparing notes. Eleanor and Margaret wore the same gowns week after week, yet the silk never wrinkled or dulled. They practiced for hours without signs of fatigue. Their lessons never advanced because there was nothing to advance. They played already at a mastery no teacher could explain. "They've been trained before," one instructor muttered. But by whom? By what? A peculiar story spread from a janitor who swore he saw the sisters in the practice rooms after midnight, long after the conservatory had closed. He claimed to hear Margaret's piano echoing down the empty hall, the notes so low and heavy they shook the glass in the doors. When he entered, he saw the sisters not seated but standing, hand in hand, before the darkened instrument. And still, the piano played. The next day he was gone, quit his post, fled the city, leaving no explanation but the tale he whispered to his cousin. That cousin, however, carried it into taverns, where men drank and crossed themselves, muttering of spirits and demons. Yet for all the whispers, the sisters continued to attend their lessons and recitals, serene as ever, as though no rumor touched them. Their presence brought prestige to the conservatory, patrons flocking to hear even a single note from them. Boston's wealthy mothers, though unsettled, encouraged their daughters to befriend them, believing proximity to such talent must be advantageous. The daughters tried, but found friendship impossible. The Callahans listened politely, smiled faintly, but never truly engaged. Their eyes always seemed elsewhere, as if watching something unseen. It was here that Dr. Harland resolved to study them. He began attending every recital, taking notes not of the music but of their manner, their expressions, their very breathing, or lack thereof. He became convinced that the Callahan sisters were not mere curiosities of talent but something beyond the natural. And though Boston society was content to whisper in parlors, Harland determined to discover what truth lay behind their unchanging faces. For in the glow of the conservatory's lamps, amid the applause and admiration, one fact grew harder to deny. While students around them stumbled and aged, the Callahan sisters remained as they had always been. Neither a crease nor a blemish marked them. And though seasons turned, they never seemed to notice. Boston had welcomed them into its proudest halls of art and music. But within those very walls, suspicion was taking root, and the legend deepened. Eleanor and Margaret Callahan, two sisters who, by all accounts, never aged a day. Dr. Nathaniel Harland was not a man given to fancy. At 42, he had built his reputation on blunt diagnosis and unflinching dissection of human frailty. Where others muttered about vapors or curses, he spoke of nerves, humors, and circulation. His office on Tremont Street was filled with anatomical sketches, jars of preserved organs, and stacks of journals from London and Paris. He prided himself on reason in a city still prone to superstition. And yet, after a single evening at the conservatory, reason had slipped from him. The Callahan sisters occupied his thoughts as no patient ever had. Their composure, their impossible mastery of music, their eerie effect on the audience, it all gnawed at him. For nights afterward, he lay awake replaying their performance, not for its beauty but for its precision. He had seen fainting spells in women before, especially in overheated halls, but never an entire room reduced to tears. Their pulses slowed, their breathing irregular, all from a single melody. It was not art, he decided. It was influence, control. Harland began discreet inquiries. He asked colleagues if they knew of the Callahan's family, their origins, their past. Answers were scarce. Some insisted the sisters were Irish gentry fleeing famine years. Others claimed French tutors had reared them abroad. But no one could produce a record, a baptismal certificate, a ship's manifest. Nothing. They had appeared in Boston as though conjured, their name whispered but never written in any registry. Compelled, Harland began to follow them. He hired a young apprentice, Matthew Crane, to assist. Together they trailed the sisters from the conservatory to their house on Ashmont Hill, careful to keep distance. More than once they lost sight of them, turning a corner only to find empty streets where the sisters should have been. But Harland was not deterred. He kept notes in a leather-bound journal, sketching times, locations, impressions. The entries soon darkened. Skin pale, no fluctuation with weather. Eyes reflective, almost luminescent in certain lamps. No sign of respiration observed in extended stillness. The first direct encounter came in June. Harland contrived to meet them outside the conservatory, introducing himself as a physician with admiration for their music. Margaret inclined her head politely. Eleanor studied him with unsettling calm. "You watch closely," she said, her voice low but clear. Harland felt a chill at the words, as though she knew his secret pursuit. He stammered a reply about being a man of observation, but the sisters merely exchanged a glance, the faintest smile passing between them, before stepping into their waiting carriage. That night, Harland dreamed of them. He saw Eleanor standing at the foot of his bed, her eyes gray as smoke, her hand resting lightly upon his chest. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, the sensation of cool fingers still lingering on his skin. Shaking, he wrote in his journal, "They intrude upon thought. This is no mere curiosity. It is contagion of the mind. His apprentice grew frightened. Matthew confessed that he too had dreamed of the sisters, though he swore he had never seen them closely. In his vision, they walked across a frozen river, their gowns untouched by frost, their reflections absent from the ice. Harlan chastised him for impressionable nerves, but privately noted the coincidence with unease. Determined, Harlan resolved to test them. He invited the sisters to his office under the pretense of admiration for their musical gifts, suggesting he wished to commission a portrait of them for his study. To his surprise, they accepted. One foggy evening they arrived, dressed in somber gowns, their presence filling the small office with a gravity that unsettled even Harlan. He pretended casual conversation, but all the while he watched, every movement, every breath, every flicker of expression. And he found what he feared. Their stillness was too perfect. Their hands rested like marble upon their laps. Their eyes never fluttered. Their skin bore no flush. At one point, he deliberately let the fire die low, watching for any shiver or sign of discomfort. None came. When he offered wine, Eleanor raised the glass, but did not drink. Margaret touched it to her lips without swallowing. Their courtesy masked refusal, but to Harlan it was confirmation. They consumed nothing. As they rose to leave, Eleanor paused. "Doctor," she said softly, "you seek answers." Harlan froze, throat tightening. "I seek only truth," he managed. "Truth," Eleanor repeated, her eyes gleaming faintly. "It is not always kind to those who demand it." Margaret touched her sister's arm, and together they departed, leaving Harlan shaken. From that night, he felt watched. Shadows lingered too long in his office. Footsteps echoed on streets where no one walked. His patients began to complain of unease in his presence, as though he carried some pall with him. Harlan knew he was unraveling, yet obsession drove him deeper. He pored over old texts, tales of changelings, revenants, beings caught between life and death. The Callahan sisters fit none entirely, yet hinted at all. By autumn, Harlan confided in only his journal. "They are not mortal in the sense we know. Their music bends will, their presence halts decay. I must know the source, whether curse, blessing, or contagion. If it is a science, it can be measured. If it is not, then God help us all. But knowledge once sought demands a price." And the more Harlan pursued the mystery of the Callahan sisters, the more he felt the threads of his own life fraying, for the legend was no longer rumor. It had entered the house of reason itself, and reason was beginning to falter. By the autumn of 1871, the Callahan residence on Ashmont Hill had become as much a part of Boston lore as its cobbled streets and gaslit alleys. The house stood quiet and pristine, its shutters repaired, its windows glowing each evening like beacons in the fog. Yet, as any neighbor who dared linger near the gate would tell you, there were doors within the house that never opened for visitors, doors that remained locked against the world outside. And it was these doors, thick with iron and polished oak, that Dr. Nathaniel Harlan longed to uncover. Harlan's obsession had grown with the passing months. Each encounter, each observation of the sisters, only deepened the mystery. The more he watched, the more he noticed the patterns, the sisters' routine, the unchanging stillness of their lives, and the house's curious arrangements. Deliveries arrived only during specific hours, never leaving marks of entry. Servants were never seen, yet the house remained immaculate. He became convinced that the answers lay not in their faces, their music, or their composure, but behind the locked doors of Ashmont Hill. One evening, under the guise of an invitation to a musical gathering at the sisters' home, Harlan gained entry. The drawing room was a testament to elegance. High ceilings, thick velvet drapes, and furniture polished to a reflective gleam. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of long-dead ancestors with stern eyes that seemed to judge the living. The sisters greeted him with their customary calm, leading him through a tour of the house. Yet no door beyond the common rooms was offered. Every attempt at casual inquiry about the upstairs chambers was met with polite deflection. "Some rooms are private," Eleanor said, her gray eyes fixed on him, unsettling in their depth. Margaret nodded, offering nothing further. Harland, ever persistent, feigned casual interest in the architecture, but his attention never wavered from the locked doors. Each one seemed to hum with a hidden presence, as though the very wood and iron pulsed with secrets. He took careful note of their locations, the way shadows fell across the panels, and the faint chill that clung near them. That night, unable to sleep, he returned to his journal, sketching floor plans from memory, noting every detail, every anomaly. Something lies behind those doors, something the sisters guard jealously, and whatever it is, it may explain why they remain unchanged. A week later, Harland received a peculiar invitation, a card, hand-delivered, written in Margaret's delicate script. It read simply, "Dr. Harland, curiosity is a dangerous companion. Meet us at midnight if you wish to learn more." That night, the doctor approached the house under a waning moon. The fog rolled thick over the hill, and the cold air bit at his cheeks. The front door, usually bolted against intruders, opened without resistance. The sisters stood in the entryway, their expression serene, their eyes glinting in the pale light. "You seek the truth," Eleanor said softly. "Then you must follow us." They led him through corridors he had never seen, passing rooms that shimmered faintly, as though illuminated from within. Behind a narrow hallway, Eleanor paused at a door reinforced with iron studs. She produced no key. Instead, Margaret placed her hand against the center panel. Harland saw the door tremble. As if alive, and slowly it swung open. Beyond it lay a chamber that defied expectation. The room was vast, though the walls curved in strange angles, as if perspective itself had shifted. Shelves lined the interior, filled with jars, books, and artifacts unlike any he had ever encountered. Bottles contained liquids that shimmered, with shifting colors, powders that seemed to breathe, and fragments of objects that appeared centuries old yet freshly preserved. In one corner rested two mirrors, tall and narrow, their surfaces warped, reflecting not the present but something older, older than the house, older than Boston itself. Harland felt a chill unlike any he had known. What is this?" he whispered. Eleanor turned to him, expression calm. "It is where time is kept," she said, "and where it does not touch us." Margaret moved to a small cabinet, opening it to reveal two delicate cradles, lined with velvet, empty save for faintly glowing symbols etched into the fabric. Harland stared, bewildered. Are these—" "Not cradles," Eleanor corrected gently. "Vessels, for life, for memory, for preservation." She gestured to the shelves, to the jars, to the mirrors. "We are sustained here, watched over. Time does not claim us, because it is drawn away and stored for those who must never change." Harland reeled back, heart pounding. Science and superstition clashed violently in his mind. Could this be some elaborate trick of optics, chemistry, or mechanics? Or was it something beyond comprehension, an alchemy of life itself? He glanced at the mirrors. In one he saw his own reflection, pale and trembling. In the other, he glimpsed his younger self, seated as a child in his mother's kitchen, the years flowing backward in a silent, terrifying river. "You see," Eleanor said softly, "the world moves. We remain. And what you see is the choice of those who guard themselves from decay." Harland's pulse quickened. "But why? Why are you like this?" Margaret's voice was almost a whisper. "Because some things cannot be left to chance. Some lives, some souls, must endure untouched. To bear witness, to act when others falter, we are those witnesses. We are the guardians of time that passes." For a long moment Harland stood silent, overwhelmed by the impossible reality before him. The air seemed charged, alive, filled with the pulse of things he could not name. The sisters watched him patiently, as though testing whether his mind could accept the truth. When he finally spoke, it was in a voice barely audible. "And what of the world outside? What of Boston?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "It continues, unaware. And that is how it must be. Some doors remain locked, Doctor, so that others may live in ignorance and time may move in its own fashion. Not all are meant to understand. As the sisters closed the chamber door behind them, the iron-studded panel sealing itself without a sound, Harland understood that he had glimpsed something forbidden, a secret that, once known, could not be forgotten. And in that revelation lay both awe and terror, for he realized that nothing would ever look the same again. Neither the city, nor the sisters, nor even time itself. He stumbled into the foggy night, heart racing, mind reeling. The house on Ashmont Hill was silent. Once more, its windows dark, its secrets intact. And somewhere inside, Eleanor and Margaret moved with unchanging grace, untouched by the years, untouched by the world, guardians of a truth too vast and terrible for mortal comprehension. The autumn winds of 1872 had sharpened into a biting chill. Boston streets rattled with the clatter of carriage wheels over cobblestones slicked by rain, and fog rolled in heavy from the harbor, swallowing the gas lamps in a ghostly gray haze. Dr. Nathaniel Harland had not seen the Callahan sisters. In weeks, though, his thoughts remained tethered to them, haunted by the vision of their chamber, the jars, the mirrors, the cradles of preserved life. He had resolved to observe them once more, to document the truth before it dissolved like mist in the winter air. It was a Thursday, market day, and Harland followed his usual path along Tremont Street toward Ashmont Hill. The streets were quieter than usual. Even the hawkers kept their voices low, as though anticipating some unknown presence. As he approached the Callahan house, he noticed a faint light spilling from the windows, a soft glow that seemed too steady, too purposeful for the late hour. Harland's pulse quickened. Something unusual was afoot. He lingered near the gate, peering through the wrought iron bars, and saw the sisters for the first time in weeks. Eleanor and Margaret stood in the garden, side by side, their forms illuminated by the flickering light of lanterns. The air around them shimmered slightly, like heat waves rising from a forge, though the night was cold. Before Harland could move closer, the sisters turned as one, their gray eyes meeting his. In that instant, he felt a weight descend upon his chest, a pressure unlike anything he had known. His legs trembled, and the fog seemed to coil around him, thick and suffocating. Eleanor raised a hand, and Margaret mirrored her motion, and the lantern's glow intensified, casting long shadows that stretched across the garden and up the walls of the house. And then they were gone. Harland stumbled forward, blinking against the sudden darkness. The lanterns had vanished, the sisters had vanished, and the garden was empty save for dew-laden grass. The house itself remained still, silent, unbroken, as if the night had swallowed not only the sisters, but the very air they had occupied. Panic gripped him. He pounded on the front door, called their names, but no sound answered him beyond the whisper of the wind. Neighbors later reported strange occurrences that night. Some swore the house appeared to flicker, as though it existed partially in another realm. One young girl claimed she saw figures moving behind the curtains, ethereal and pale, yet when she approached, the windows reflected only the empty room. Others heard music, faint and otherworldly, drifting through the streets, melodies that rose and fell without source, tugging at hearts with longing and dread. Harland, refusing to leave, broke into the house, forcing the doors with tools he carried for emergencies. The interior was pristine, untouched, yet he felt the echo of absence. The chamber he had glimpsed months before, the room of jars and mirrors, was empty. All the artifacts, the vessels, the glowing symbols, vanished as if they had never existed. Only the walls remained, cold and bare, bearing no trace of the impossible. Days turned into weeks, and the sisters did not return. Boston buzzed with speculation. Had they been spirited away? Had they abandoned the city? Or had they, as some whispered, returned to the timeless realm they once inhabited, beyond human reckoning? Newspapers ran accounts of the mysterious disappearance of the Callahan sisters, though they had never been seen publicly in such numbers before. The reports were confused, filled with conflicting eyewitness testimony, yet all agreed on one fact: they were gone. Harland, meanwhile, descended into obsession and despair. He searched Ashmont Hill for hidden passages, secret stairways, anything that could explain their vanishing. He scoured libraries for accounts of similar phenomena, ancient texts describing changelings, revenants, and spirits suspended between life and death. Nothing satisfied him. It was as if the sisters had become part of a reality he could not perceive, their lives existing in a layer beyond the normal flow of time. One night, as he sat at his desk feverishly writing in his journal, he heard music, soft, delicate, and unmistakable. It was Margaret's piano, and yet no piano existed in his study. The notes drifted through the open window, carrying with them the same haunting quality he had witnessed at the conservatory. Harland rose, trembling, and stepped into the fog-drenched street, but the source eluded him. The music followed him, in silence, fading and rising with the wind, always beyond reach. In the days that followed, the house on Ashmont Hill stood silent, doors locked, windows dark. Harland returned to his practice, but the emptiness gnawed at him. Patience whispered, of chills in his presence, of feelings of being watched. Every reflective surface, the mirrors in his office, the polished floors, even the glass of his windows, seemed to hint at unseen eyes, shadows that bent differently, shapes that shifted when unobserved. It became clear to Harland that the Callahan sisters had left more than Boston. They had left a residue, a mark upon time itself. People who had once encountered them reported dreams of impossible rooms, of mirrors reflecting not the present but centuries past, of music that moved the soul as if memory and longing had been distilled into sound. And the doctor, perhaps more than any, knew the truth. They were no ordinary beings. Their presence had always been an intrusion upon reality, and their vanishing was proof that they existed by rules not bound to human understanding. By winter, their disappearance became legend. Children dared one another to approach the darkened. Gates' lovers spoke of them in hushed tones, and the city collectively remembered a strange grace that had moved among the streets. Some said they had fled, others claimed they had been called back to a hidden realm. But one thing remained certain. The Callahan sisters, Eleanor and Margaret, had vanished in a manner consistent with everything about them, perfect, enigmatic, and utterly beyond comprehension. And yet, even in their absence, Boston could not forget them. The echo of their footsteps, the haunting music, the strange calm that seemed to follow in their wake, all persisted like shadows cast by a sun long gone. Harland, alone in his study, wrote in his final notes before leaving the city, "They never aged, they never died, they have vanished, and yet I feel them still, watching, waiting, guardians of a time that bends around them. If they are gone, then what remains of us is fragile indeed." The legend of the Callahan sisters had entered the city's memory, and though their forms were unseen, their story would haunt Boston forever. Years passed, and Boston changed. Cobblestones were replaced with smoother streets. Gas lamps gave way to flickering electric lights, and new buildings rose where old brick houses had once stood. Yet Ashmont Hill remained largely untouched. The Callahan residence, with its tall windows and silent shutters, loomed like a monument to a past. The city tried both to remember and to forget. For the people of Boston, the story of Eleanor and Margaret Callahan had become more than rumor. It was legend, a cautionary tale whispered at hearths, in taverns, and along fog-shrouded alleyways. Dr. Nathaniel Harland had left the city not long after their vanishing, haunted by the impossibility of what he had witnessed. His journals, filled with meticulous observations, sketches of the chambers, floor plans of the house, and frantic notes on the sisters' stillness, were bound and hidden away, kept from the public eye. Scholars who later discovered fragments of his writings described them as bizarre, unnerving, and brilliant, an attempt to rationalize the inexplicable. Yet even in his absence, Harland could not erase the sensation of being watched, the feeling that Eleanor and Margaret lingered somewhere, just beyond perception, their attention fixed silently upon the world that had moved on without them. Locals told stories in hushed tones. A baker's apprentice swore he once glimpsed two pale figures at the edge of a market square, standing perfectly still amidst the bustle of carts and shouting vendors. A milkman claimed that one winter night, snow, falling heavily, he saw two women walking down Tremont Street, carrying baskets yet leaving no footprints. And children, wide-eyed and daring, whispered of gray-eyed sisters who appeared in dreams, guiding them, warning them, or simply observing with an inscrutable patience. The house itself became a point of fascination. Visitors, those who could, braved the hill after dusk, reported strange lights moving behind its windows, shadows that bent unnaturally, and the faint echo of music, piano or violin, drifting on the night air. Some nights it seemed the walls themselves sighed, breathing the past into the present. Yet no one entered, for the doors remained locked, the keys vanished with the sisters, and the city's authorities dismissed the tales as imagination-run. Wild, Boston's historians decades later attempted to trace the Callahan lineage, but records were frustratingly incomplete. Birth certificates, immigration papers, parish records, all vanished or conflicted. Some speculated that the sisters had arrived from Ireland, fleeing famine, others that they had been tutored abroad, perhaps in France or Italy, yet none could reconcile the records with the accounts of the sisters' seeming immortality, nor explain their sudden disappearance. Scholars could only note in marginalia and footnotes that two women had appeared in 1871 and then vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of accounts that grew more fantastic with each retelling. The city adapted the legend into its culture. Writers wove tales of ghostly sisters who walked timelessly, musicians composed eerie melodies in their honor, and playwrights dramatized the mystery for audiences who thrilled at the possibility of the supernatural intruding upon ordinary life. And yet, for all the stories, no one could claim certainty. The Callahan sisters had existed, or so the accounts insisted, but they had never conformed to the natural laws that governed the rest of humanity. They were, in essence, outside time. Even in private moments, the memory lingered. Elderly residents recounted the cold pressure in their chests when first meeting the sisters, the way conversations felt lighter, more hollow, as if some presence had sapped the weight of ordinary life. Lovers whispered of the pale gray eyes, of hands that had brushed theirs briefly, leaving a chill that no fire could dispel, and all agreed, whether alive, vanished, or something else entirely, Eleanor and Margaret Callahan were unchanged, untouched, eternal. Dr. Harlan's last notes, recovered posthumously, capture the final unease of their enduring mystery. He wrote of shadows, of music, of glimpses through mirrors in which he saw not himself, but the city as it had been decades prior, unchanged, suspended. They move beyond decay, he penned, beyond time. To witness them is to glimpse eternity itself. We live in moments, they inhabit forever. The Callahan residence on Ashmont Hill eventually fell into quiet disrepair. Its windows grew dusty, its shutters sagged, yet it never seemed entirely abandoned. Some claimed that on moonlit nights the sisters could be seen through the glass, sitting side by side, gazing outward with the same calm, inscrutable expressions they had worn in life. And perhaps they did not leave, not entirely. Perhaps they lingered as guardians, observers, or witnesses to the world they had once moved among. The legend endured. Parents told it to children who strayed too far after dusk. Merchants shared it when the markets grew too quiet, and strangers from other cities carried whispers of Boston's mysterious, unaging sisters back to distant towns. Eleanor and Margaret Callahan, in life and in absence, had left a mark on the city that could not fade. Time, which claimed all else, passed over their heads without effect. And the people of Boston, those who remembered and those who only heard the stories, continued to speak their names with a mixture of reverence, fear, and awe. Eleanor and Margaret Callahan, two sisters who never aged a day, who moved through the city like shadows of eternity, whose story lingered long after they had vanished, and whose legend would endure as long as Boston itself remembered to whisper.